Welcome back. You're switching into news and views, and we're going to be switching gears now to a very, very important conversation. The debate around immigration in South Africa. It is becoming increasingly complex and increasingly polarized to many. On one hand, there are growing concerns from communities who say illegal immigration is placing pressure on already strained resources, from healthcare to housing and employment. And then on the other hand, you have what is very, very unpalatable. What human rights groups warn that this kind of frustration and this modus operandi is too often spilling over into violence and discrimination against foreign nationals and what can only be described as xenophobia and Afrophobia. Then the question is, and I hope you'll engage us on this one, and it's a very, very difficult but necessary one. Are South Africans being unfairly labeled as xenophobic, or are there legitimate concerns about illegal immigration being expressed in ways that risk crossing a dangerous line? I don't think any of us want the scenes of 2010, 2009, and many others, where we saw people essentially being killed, being stoned, and being burnt alive, all because they are not from South Africa. Government has acknowledged the pressures, but has also cautioned against lawlessness and vigilantism, especially as tensions flare in parts of Gauteng, I think the KZN and Eastern Cape in recent months. And we're now going to be joined by Ngqabutho Nicholas Mabhena. He's the chairman of the Zim-Community here in South Africa. They're a group that has been wildly affected by these. And we're going to be unpacking a very, very important conversation on whether what we're seeing unfold in the streets right now is xenophobia. Can it be labeled as that? Is there a better way to deal with this? South Africa, I think at this point we can all agree that it's dealing with or grappling with immigration challenges, and it is coming at a time of economic strain. People don't have an outlet, and the only closest people to blame for this are those that come from other parts of the continent, and it's something that we shouldn't be promoting in any form, in any shape, because it is that, when you're going to attack people because of where they come from, what language they speak, or how you perceive their skin color to be, it's a form of criminality. It needs to be confirmed. It needs to be dealt with in any way necessary. Mr. Ngqabutho, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure having you on Salam Media, and I think very, very important to be having this very, I think, charged conversation in the country right now.
Thank you so much. Morning to you and morning to the viewers out there.
And I think we'll jump right into it. From your perspective as someone that's representing the Zimbabwean community here in South Africa, a leader in that front. What do you make of what we're currently seeing unfolding in the country right now? Do you think South Africans are being too quickly labeled as xenophobic, or they are concerns and incidences that should be called out because they could potentially drive us to a very, very dangerous place, where we could see scenes of previous years that were very, very unpalatable?
Well, in our view, we do not believe that South Africans are xenophobic. Yes, you have these attacks that are happening. These are coming from the minority, because if you were to say South Africans are xenophobic, it means that an outcome of an election, which in our view is scientific, will be reflective of that. If you study the 2024 election outcome, it does not reflect that South Africans are xenophobic. The drop, for instance, of the ANC to 40%, in our view, it was not attributed to what others will say is a lenience towards migrants. The rise of MK Party, becoming the second largest party in South Africa, it was based on Zulu nationalism. It was not based, in our view, on its attitude towards foreign migrants. Yes, there are right-wing formations like Action South Africa and the others, the party-led Patriotic Alliance. We know that Patriotic Alliance gained its votes mainly from the colored community. Action SA was very low. Even the opinion polls that have been done recently, they place those parties whose leaders are seen to be anti-migrants at about 3%. You then look at the ANC and the DA. If they were to combine their votes, and if the voting was to happen in the next 3 months or so, you will know that they will score close to about 67%. So we think that those that are coming out, the minority, as xenophobic, it's as a result of the economic pressure that is happening, and also in some cases we see some third force involvement. We believe, though we don't have evidence, but we believe that some people are being sponsored to being targeting migrants because for whatever reasons they might have, whether they want to protect big supermarkets or not, because we see that the hawkers are the ones that are being targeted in the main. Small spaza shops are the ones being targeted, and we know that if hawkers were to move out in front of the supermarkets, small businesses like spaza shops were going to close down. We know who the beneficiary would be, but like I'm saying, we don't have evidence to that, but we are simply analyzing what we see on the ground. And of course there's economic pressure, and the people think, some think that if you were to drive out migrants, then it will be an opportunity to create employment.
And I think that's very, very important to note. The economic pressure, and this all boils down to the failures of the government of the day, essentially, not just for South Africans and making sure that there are jobs and there are resources that are adequate for everyone, but also for migrants, people that are coming into South Africa, because there are complaints that Home Affairs is essentially not doing its job. There are long lines, people can't get the right paperwork to be in the country. People overstay, some of the days that are allocated to them, or the kind of paperwork that is allocated to them. From your point of view, dealing with mostly Zimbabweans that are coming into South Africa, how much of that is a factor? The fact that the Home Affairs in South Africa has been failing for quite some time, and it leaves them in a very, very precarious position when these groups, or vigilante organizations that essentially put the onus onto themselves to say, we are the ones that are going to be walking around asking for people for documentation, find themselves exposed to it.
Well, of course, we believe that it is only the police and immigration officials who have a right to ask people documents. A private citizen, we don't think they are qualified to undergo such an exercise, because it's quite a detail. But you know that with respect to the specific question you are asking, people overstaying, whether Home Affairs is managing. In the case of Zimbabwe, the majority of Zimbabweans that are coming to South Africa are economic migrants. And when they arrive in South Africa, they want to legalize their stay, but unfortunately, they will not qualify, or they do not qualify if one looks into the various permits or visas that are out there, about 17 of them or so. So people then resort to working without permits, which of course this annoys organizations like March to March, Operation Dudula, that undocumented migrants are working in South Africa. This is what we are faced with. You will also know that prior to the granting of the Zimbabwe exemption permits, people resorted to using an asylum document, a Section 22, which allowed them to conduct business, work, and starting. And according to the Director General of Home Affairs, the system came under intensive pressure around 2008 to about 2010, and they began to sing and ease to that pressure once people then moved to the special permits which were granted in 2010. So in general, you have Zimbabweans that would not qualify in terms of the visas that have been provided for, and then they're getting employed in the construction sector, get employed as domestic workers without the necessary legal documents. These, of course, are separate from the holders of special permits.
Very, very important to note. I want to come back to the dangers that at least I've been seeing, especially online, where immigrants, people that are not from South Africa, you open this conversation very, very well by saying, just looking at the voting patterns, you wouldn't conclude that South Africans are xenophobic. How dangerous is it for these kinds of attacks that we are seeing, from people that are not in the country, that essentially just blast South Africans? That's you're xenophobic. South Africans have never, saw themselves as real Africans. They've been prejudiced against, black Africans. If it was anyone else, they wouldn't be reacting this way. How dangerous is that sentiment? Almost vilifying South Africans who are mostly, as you alluded to, you know, making concerns that are valid, and that should be treated with some sense of urgency because of the frustrations that people have right now.
It paints South Africa as a not pan-African out there, because when you see blacks attacking other blacks based on their nationality, South Africa becomes, as a country or a nation that is not pan-African, does not share in the solidarity of the broader African community, as it were. So we think that the South African government find itself between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, it protects, in our view, maybe it has got nothing, it has no power to intervene because of the clauses in the AU and SADC that no interference in member states. So it finds itself not being able to act against the governments that violate their constitutions, governments that commit economic crimes leading to the collapse of their own economies. Then citizens of those countries flock into South Africa. On the other hand, South Africa then has to balance the issue of the interests of its own citizens, because every country, of course, must prioritize its own citizens. So when you have unemployment at about 31.4%, you have undocumented people working in South Africa with this economic pressure, and South Africa being the most unequal society in the world, naturally, those that are on the receiving end who feel that the government is really protecting migrants, and then you will see in these demonstrations which we are seeing. We hope that South Africa should, at the very least, be frank with its governments in Africa to say whatever economic policies that you pursue, whatever production you organize or lack of it, and your politics in your country, it has a bearing on South Africa, because instead of citizens challenging their own governments, they get to South Africa. We ourselves in Zimbabwe, we get accused of not challenging our government. We are now at a stage where the constitution is being amended to postpone or to push forward the elections. We are being accused of not doing enough in challenging the government. When citizens decide to challenge the government through other means other than the democratic processes, South Africa will be the first one to say, no, you need to respect your constitution. So these are the dilemmas that South African government find itself in. because
mm,
it then has to host these migrants that are coming from the rest of the African continent.
mm. Government to government conversations are one thing, as you mentioned, but there needs to be dialogue again internally here in South Africa between South Africans and migrants. From your point of view, how feasible is that? Do you think organizations like yourselves would be willing to sit down on a table with organizations like March and March and Operation Tutula to try and, I don't know, reach an understanding of some sort? What would that conversation look like? And have you even tried to engage with them?
In fact, we want to engage with them. We wanted to understand their own perspective. We wanted them to understand where we come from, because Zimbabwe we are a community in South Africa, and we are in South Africa using. We have different status, if I were to put it in that way. We have people that have permanent residence, who are of Zimbabwean origin. We have some who are now citizens of South Africa through naturalization. We have Zimbabweans that are legal through these special permits that were given to them in 2010. We have Zimbabweans, of course, who are not documented in South Africa. So it is a conversation that we would want to have with them. This conversation should look into the push factors. Why are Zimbabweans flocking to South Africa? And
Mm,
of course, we share a history with South Africa. Also the issues, the political issues that have been there in Zimbabwe going back to the 80s. One will talk about the genocide. One will talk about the state-sponsored violence during the days of the movement for democratic change, where we saw many Zimbabweans coming to South Africa, and the attitude of the South African government towards that. So is the kind of the conversation that we'll want to have. Even if you look into the white paper, South Africa speaks of first is it the first country principle. If one is running away from persecution, Zimbabwe and South Africa share a border. So
mm,
we are not like saying migrants from Nigeria or Ghana who will have to cross the other countries to get to South Africa. So we are neighbors. So we need to have this discussion to say, how do we find a solution to these challenges that we find ourselves in?
mm. Are there fears within the Zimbabwean community right now? What's the sentiment on the ground? What conversations are being had?
Well, there are mixed views out there. I remember on Saturday, on Monday, Freedom Day, we had a meeting, a public meeting in Hillbrow for holders of Zimbabwe exemption permit, talking about the Home Affairs consultations that are ongoing on the future of Zimbabwe exemption permits. Some people couldn't come to the meeting because they were sending messages saying that they heard that there was going to be a march by March and March and the other organizations within Hillbrow. So that shows you that other people are really scared. But of course, there are others who are saying, look, they've got March and March and the others, they've got a democratic right in terms of the South African Constitution to express themselves, as long as their march does not then target migrants, and we end up seeing violence. So there are mixed reactions to what is currently happening. And some, of course, are saying we also, as Zimbabweans, need to put our house in order, resolve our own economic and political crisis in Zimbabwe.
Mhm. Thank you so much for that. I think it's very, very important, to have these kind of conversations and, to put in perspective the conversations that are being had on the ground and to try and find solutions to what could unfortunately spill out into something very, very ugly and that I don't think none of us want to see at this point. And I hope we're going to chat again soon. Really, really appreciate it.
The pleasure is mine.
There you go. I think a very, very sober conversation there by Mr. Ngqabutho Nicholas Mabhena, chairman of the Zim-Community of South Africa, giving us insight on the feeling, the sentiment on the ground, especially amongst the Zimbabwean community who are in South Africa very, very large number, very, very considerate amount of Zimbabweans in South Africa because obviously, as you heard there from Mr. Mabhena, the history that we share with Zimbabwe, the close proximity of the two countries we share a border, and I think it's going to be important to have these kinds of conversations because I've always said this, it's dangerous and very unfair and very precarious if people are going to be quick to dismiss South Africans and call them xenophobic. I think if there's one thing that South Africans have demonstrated over the years, especially in the new democratic dispensation, is that they're not xenophobic. South Africans share neighborhoods, South Africans share resources, South Africans share everything with immigrants that come from all parts of the world, Africa in particular, because, well, we are Africans at the end of the day. And South Africans recognize that the mere fact that there's democracy in South Africa is by the solidarity of many frontline states, countries that we share a border with, countries that we are close to as a country. But something went wrong and can be attributed to the failures of our government. You can't have a country like South Africa, as complex as it is, high unemployment, government, a country that is the most unequal in the world. This according to a lot of organizations, including the United Nations. And you have porous borders. And it's all culminating. It's all coming together because South Africans are very frustrated right now. People are not working. People are unemployed. People can't get their children into schools. And to simply say South Africans are xenophobic, yes, there are xenophobic elements. There are South Africans who are a very, very small minority, but who hold very disgusting opinions about our sisters and brothers on the continent. But to simply say when South Africans express themselves and say, well, the borders are porous, it's becoming dangerous, we're having unsavory people coming into our country, they're committing crimes. I mean, there was stats that were released some time ago about the number of foreigners in our prisons almost outnumbering the amount of South Africans in prisons, and you think to yourselves, if South Africans are speaking out against that, against the criminality, against the fact that people just can't walk in and out of the country undocumented, undetected, to simply say xenophobic to a frustrated, unemployed, uneducated, hungry people that feel neglected by their government and their closest recourse, the next closest person to blame is immigrants, which is the trend everywhere else. You can go to the US, you can go to Britain. The sentiment is that. But again, another side to this conversation is the fact that as South Africa, you're a product of global solidarity. You can't ignore the fact that you live in an African continent. You have the most sophisticated economy naturally. Like the same way us as South Africans or some South Africans have ambitions to move to other parts of the world, whether it's the Middle East or move to Australia or the United States. I don't know who'd want to move to the United States right now, but hey, there are those that have those ambitions. The same way that you think, you know what, I could make a better living in a different country. It's the same way that other people view South Africa. So would it be okay if you go to those countries and you're harassed and you're called names and you're beaten up and you're abused simply because you thought, hey, I need a change of scenery, I need greener pastures, I need to make a bit more. The economy is bad in South Africa. Need to start having sober conversations. And in my opinion, it all boils down to the failures of our government. That's where your frustration needs to be pointed and directed to. And whether you do it via the vote or you do it by protesting, please, anything that is legal and the Constitution allows you to do that as a South African, go ahead. but you have no right to abuse another human being simply because they're from a different country on the African continent or anywhere else in the world, speak a different language to yours, or the most stupid one of all, they have slightly darker skin to yours. Going to take a quick break. News and views continues after this.